Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special, as we're joined by a person who really needs no introduction, but I'm very honored to be joined by Dr. Adelaide Sanford. She is the Vice Chancellor Emerita of the Board of Regents of the University of the State of New York. Welcome, Dr. Sanford, to Cultural Caravan. First of all, I want to say it was a pleasure and honor about 5 years ago when we joined you in celebration of your 90th birthday. And I'm even more overjoyed that I'm here in celebration of your 95th birthday. And we're in the year 2021, a very eventful past 5 years, and we just want to spend a little time reflecting on you, your legacy, and the countless educators and people who had the pleasure of being inspired by you. Let's just, for those in the audience who just may need to be familiarized a little bit about you as a person. I know that you are a career educator who, prior to becoming the Vice Chancellor Emerita, spent over 36 years in education as a teacher, as a principal, and then later taking on the role of Vice Chancellor Emerita. Talk to us going back. What inspired you to decide to go into education?
It wasn't a total decision on my part. All of my family, my mother, my brother, my uncles, my aunts, all were involved in teaching. Teaching is more than schooling. In addition to that, it was profoundly important that we be able to make a living. And there were not a variety of choices in terms of what was available to people of African ancestry in terms of making a living, particularly in the southern states. So it was a duality of decisions. Seeing my family members as being educators, not just schooling, but educators, and having to feel that I was able to be engaged in an occupation that could give me the opportunity to be creative and productive.
Let's talk about a bit about when you think about inspirational people in your life. There were those sheroes and heroes that you can reflect upon and you built upon in terms of as you were moving up in your career journey.
There were so many people that were part of family, not just the biological family, but the people who loved you, the neighbor next door who always asked to see your report card and was willing to help you with math because he was good at math. Even though he worked in the post office, he could have been a mathematician. The women in the church who encouraged you to make speeches and to perform. It was all of that. It was primarily my grandmother and my mother who were the most influential because they were the ones who were in my life every day until the time that we moved from Mississippi to New York before I was born. And so the influences were very wide, and it also enabled me to understand that even though I might not be a biological parent, I could still be a part of a family, a community of people that felt it was their responsibility to teach and to protect children and young adults.
Starting your career in Brooklyn at PS 28, and then later moving to PS 21 in Brooklyn, where you rose from being an assistant principal to a principal. Tell us about that journey and what inspired you not just to become a teacher, but also a leader.
When I went to PS 28, that was in 1950, the year that I was graduated from Wellesley. And of course, at Wellesley, I majored in education. But when I became a substitute teacher at PS 28, the children in the class to which I was assigned were boys. It was called an opportunity class. It was not an opportunity. It was a holding pen for these very bright, vociferous, belligerent boys. The principal of the school made it clear that the expectation for me was to keep the children in the room, keep them quiet, keep them from annoying the other people. So all of this very valuable education that I had acquired from Brooklyn College, from Columbia, from Wellesley, didn't apply to these children. And that was what was most striking to me. I was made to understand that I would not eat in the lunchroom with the European teachers, that there were no abundance of supplies, paints, clay, putty, all of the things that are a part of what they tell you is education when you're in school did not exist there. But I stayed there until PS 21 opened as a brand new building to serve the children in the housing project, Brevoort Housing. Now, the school was too small for the number of children. The school was built for about 800 or 900 children, and there were 1,100 children because people had large families. In spite of the newness of the building, the freshness of the paint, the solidity of the bricks, the notion that all you had to do was to keep the children quiet still was the philosophy. So it was my calling in my heart, in my understanding, in my genetic memory, in my understanding of what it meant to stand before a group of children and make them believe in themselves, and to see that they came not as an empty vessel to be filled with information about other people. They come with a rich heritage, with a sense of dignity that no one can remove from them, but also the genetic memory of agony and pain. And so the transition was a transition from a building that was old, cold, and dilapidated to a brand new shining edifice that had the same negative philosophy of what it meant to teach children of African ancestry. The transition physically was very apparent. Psychologically, it was deep and impressionable and has stayed with me until today.
Once you realized the impact of racism, as you know, was very vivid in terms of the disparities of educational experiences for children of African ancestry versus those of other children, and once you rose to the level of leadership, how did things change? What did you have to do as an administrator to ensure that all the teachers were on the same page, in terms of ensuring that all children in general, particularly children of African ancestry, had the same opportunities as other children to learn in your school?
It was a long, arduous journey. I did not automatically become a principal because I wanted to. I began to look at who were the leaders, who were the ones who were writing the textbooks, who were the ones that were making the decisions about what children would be taught, what holidays they celebrated, and who they were, and where were they going, and where did they come from. So there were many infractions from the transition from teacher to assistant principal to principal, and part of them were based on the fact that I could not accept the notion that these children were in any way unworthy. And one of the defining moments in the transition, I was assigned to an annex to the school because, as I told you, it was too small. So they had 2 assistant principals and a principal. I was a classroom teacher. But the difficulties in this annex, which was 2 blocks away, were so enormous because only a part of the building was used, and the children would run through the building and set fires and slam doors. And the principal had to go out on sick leave, and so she asked me if I would be the teacher in charge while she was away, knowing that she had 2 assistant principals of European background, but she didn't know that they could handle it. And so I did. And in the course of my being there, I was invited by a teacher to speak at an in-service course. And I talked about reading, and I talked about the value of having a sense of the history of these children and of who they were and what their families were like. And so I wanted to teach in this in-service course how to use reading as that instrument. And so one of the teachers from another school who was taking the course said, Sanford, she said, you are an apologist for these children. They are not deprived. They are depraved. And this was a statement made by a teacher who made her living teaching these children. She went on to describe how her parents came and her grandparents came to this country, worked hard, sacrificed, got a good education, and succeeded. And our people did not. Now, of course, I had to describe to her the difference in the circumstances that her people met and that we as came free people and became enslaved people. And of course, as a result, that bared the fangs of racism. And I was asked to apologize to this teacher. And of course, I had nothing to apologize for. I said, if you prove me wrong, then we can talk about some way of coming to reconciliation. I used that to make it clear that I just didn't move smoothly from teacher to assistant principal to principal, but there was a struggle, there was a battle, there was a confrontation, there was a challenge, there was a broken promise all along the road.
There are people in the audience who are in educational leadership who are probably thinking about what can you share with them of your experience that might be able to assist them as they work towards educating children in our community, as well as trying to work with educators, some of whom may not be as committed or as cognizant of the unique needs of our community? So what would you say to those administrators?
The first thing that I would say is that if you do not know the true history of America, if you know nothing about the richness of the continent of Africa and the great civilizations that were there, if you have had no peer relationship with people who are different from the ones you are teaching, don't teach. Very, very few people fail in courses in education. Everybody is successful. Most of the people that I met during the time that I was a principal and I had an opportunity to examine their life and their value system and what they were themselves shouldn't be teachers. So when a person asks me, what would I tell a teacher? I would say, prepare your life to be a teacher. You will not necessarily learn only in schools of education. So I would say, think carefully about being a teacher. Today they have many, many other choices. You don't have to be a teacher in order to have financial security. Many of the teachers who came into the school after I was principal and was able to know the circumstances in which they came were young women who were teaching in what was called a disadvantaged community in order to have their school loans eradicated. So they'd stay about 4 years, and once all of their loans were over, they would leave. They had no vested interest in being a teacher. They were there because they were supporting their husbands who were in medical school or dental school, or they had to open a business. Teaching was not their life's calling. They never should have been teachers. They resented the fact that we introduced preparation for testing because they didn't think the children were worthy of that. So the first thing I would say to a person who's thinking about teaching, think about who you will be teaching and what can you teach about yourself, and what can you learn about the people that you are teaching, and are you prepared psychologically to have your value system and your behavior challenged? That's what I would say to them.
What should the potential educational leader, principal, think about or consider when they are looking at leaping from the classroom into the helm of principalship?
At PS 28 and also at 21, every European male that was there only taught while he had another job or while he was practicing to become an administrator. Didn't have anything to do with his administrative ability or his willingness to be an administrator. So I would say to a person who is interested in being an administrator, what is your capacity for leadership? What is your capacity for change, even though the change may challenge your way of life and those things that you have learned that were wrong? Because you did learn that Agassiz and Toynbee said that there was no civilization in Africa, that there was no music, there was no drama, that the European had contributed everything that there was. So how do you challenge that? And who are you prepared to be an administrator for? Now, if you are a person who sees education and schooling as an act of rebellion, as a revolutionary act, then there's a different message. That message would be, understand how the system functions in order to change it. You have to know how it functions. When I became a member of the Board of Regents, and on many occasions spoke to teachers and people who were going to be administrators, they didn't understand how the system worked. They didn't know anything about the Regents other than that it was an examination. So I would ask anyone who's going into teaching or administration, search your soul. Make sure that this is a calling and not just a way to make a living and move up the ladder. Because education is more than schooling. It includes health, it includes housing, it includes instructional materials. I know for years I did not order books for the PS21 after I became principal because they didn't have any black salespeople. And I say, come back when you have some people who look like the children that are in this room. They would say to me, well, do you want the same thing that we did for the other principals? And I didn't know what that was. I said, I don't know what you mean. They said, well, you know, you make two orders. You make one order for paper and pencils and crayons for the school. And that's what you submit. But then you make an order for what you want personally. This had been going on for years. I didn't know it. So when you hear of schools not having resources and not having supplies and materials and paint and maps and globes and libraries, understand how much has gone on for so many years that deprived our children of the resources. So I would consider all of that. When you become an administrator, it's not just that you make out a plan book or find out how to scan the day to make sure that everybody gets a prep period. It means looking at a system that has to grow, that has to change, that has to improve in order for things to be better. And that can be very frightening and threatening. And then on the other hand, the schools of education aren't going to teach you that because they don't know it. I was at Fordham on a Ford Foundation fellowship for a year, some years back, and the people who were teaching in this course, which was called urban education, didn't know anything about urban education. They didn't know what a paraprofessional was. They didn't know about the lunch program. They didn't know about the bus schedules. But they were the people who were there in the college, and therefore they became the teacher of the people who were going to be administrators. So if you're going into administration, think of yourself as a change agent. And if you're willing to make those changes, even though they may threaten some things that you have learned, and you may have to learn some things that you did not even know existed.
As an administrator, what are some of the things that you would recommend in order for someone to just not engage, but to also educate the parents?
You can't help children to grow and to see themselves as productive and functional without working with parents. And many teachers and principals are not prepared to do that, and administrators, because if they're working in underserved communities, they don't have a basis for knowing anything about the parents. One of the engagements with parents at Public School 21 was to find out what the parent wanted. Parents were very young, particularly the parents of the children who were coming in as pre-K and kindergarten. So I would do an inventory with them to find out what did they want. Many of them wanted more education themselves. Many of them didn't have a high school diploma. They wanted to self-improve. They wanted fulfillment of their lives. So we began to plan programs that addressed the interest of the parents so that we could bring in people who would do the GED for them, give them a place to study, give them a typewriter, help them to fulfill their dreams, and then have the teachers in the school visit the Brevoort houses. So you have to understand the situation of the parents and not make a judgment about them. Now, unfortunately, sometimes because of the pathology of the chattel slave experience and the way we were socialized away from each other, it's been in recent years that we talk about community and coming together. There were people who felt more comfortable when they had a principal who was of European background. And there was a parent who was very difficult. Whatever I said, whatever I did, she was opposed to it. So I had taught teachers that when a parent comes, or you send for a parent, be sure you have something positive to say about the child. No parent wants to come to school to hear that the child can't read or that he's disobedient. So you have to have something pleasant. Now, if you can't find any pleasant thing, come and talk to me and we'll find something positive. Then the next step was to get the teacher to understand that this parent loved his or her child, and that they wanted the best for that child, and that they expected the school to fulfill that. So we had a double whammy because the parents had an inordinate trust in the teacher, and the teacher had a wrongful impression of the parent. We were so successful in bringing parents into the school that we had to make a list of voluntary positions for people to fulfill because everybody wanted to come to school. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, you know, Dr. Sanford, you have provided so much information, particularly for those on the other side of the tube that probably are just trying to figure out how you did it and how you were able to build a success story amongst our children in a community that some were thought was the most challenged. And so I know that, you know, as we move into our next segment, we're going to talk about some of the strategies that you use to really engage your teaching staff to really pursue other things and develop themselves personally, and some of which have become the top administrators in our country. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.